Discussions about buying an EV are commonplace in many circles. Most of these discussions focus around questions like, are there enough charging stations? What do we do if the vehicle suddenly stops running on the road? Why can't we charge the battery with renewable energy? To discuss about the as-is and the to-be situation of the charging infrastructure, renewable energy for EV charging and other infrastructure needed to fuel the growth of new mobility, we have a panel, a very knowledgeable panel, to share some insights. May I now invite on stage Mr. Akshay Singhal, co-founder of Log9 Materials, Mr. Jyotiranjan Harichandan, co-founder Bolt Energy, Mr. Maxson Lewis, Chief Engineering Officer, Magenta Par, Mr. Vinayak Kathare, Head New Initiatives, Fourth Partner Energy, and our moderator for the session, Ms. Chaitanya Kanuri, Senior Manager, Electric Mobility, WRI India. Thank you, panelists, for joining us here today. Chaitanya, over to you.
Welcome, everyone, to the panel on building infrastructure and fueling growth with clean energy for EVs. Thank you all for taking the time, and we hope we have your attention after a heavy lunch. So when we're speaking about the importance of charging infrastructure, it's been stated enough, I think. Every panel that we've already had over yesterday and today continue to speak about the need and importance of charging infrastructure and the kind of barrier that it continues to be in the minds of many people. Maybe be it speaking about public, residential, or fleet charging, be it speaking about slow or fast plug-in charging or battery swapping. There are a lot of moving pieces in the ecosystem today, and the way forward is evolving very rapidly. So I'm really excited to actually speak to these very knowledgeable panelists today and get some clarity on what some of the current trends are and how we can optimize the growth going forward, be it in terms of getting the right clean energy mix in place or improving the efficiency of the charging infrastructure rollout. So without further ado, I'll jump right into the discussion. And I'd like to start with Maxson. So Maxson is, as was announced, the MD of Magenta. And Maxson, what are the major trends you see in EV charging infrastructure today? What is being done well, and what still needs to be improved?
First of all, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back post-COVID era and to see a lot of people together and to see the kind of surge that we have in the EV space. Interestingly, and unknown to many, there's a lot of focus on only one aspect of EV charging, and that's when are the chargers on the highways. And we have heard earlier, but that's not really where charging is really happening. Statistically, 60% of charging globally happens at destinations for individuals. And for fleet, of course, at the fleet hubs. The only aspect of EV charging which happens on the roadside is the public, for the sorting out the range anxiety. So unknown to many, there's a lot of things that are already happening in India. India's first residential or community charging was set up in 2018, where people came together, realized that they need to solve the problem of plenty of EVs coming and charging and how to sort that. Incidentally, there's a lot of work happening in the fleet charging space. There are a lot of solutions which are coming together, and this is the best part about the EV industry. It's starting from zero, and that's you have the traditional companies and also a lot of startups which are working in that space. So what's happening right in India is we have skipped a generation of EV in terms of the protocols being set. We know the protocols are already in place, so we don't, redundancy in protocols are sorted out. So that is behind us. We have been able to learn a lot from other countries, be it in the four-wheeler space, bus. Also, we have got a sense of what are the challenges. So I think India is poised at this point in time, and I think in terms of having the right infrastructure, the right solutions, and the right automobiles and the OEMs in place. Right now, it's a time of how do you scale it up. That's where we at Magenta look at it from that perspective on our EV charging side of things.
Thanks so much, Maxson. You're right that, yeah, a lot is happening, and keeping track of it and understanding that we're building on it becomes very important. Moving on, Akshay, how do you see battery technology evolving and what impacts will that have on the future of charging?
So, globally, battery technology is evolving at a very, very fast pace, right? And that's the reason we see a lot of confusion, or in the sense that a dynamicity in the market. That, okay, today we are deploying this solution, will it become obsolete tomorrow? What next is coming up? So that's the kind of pace of the ecosystem in general. But the good thing that is happening is that now batteries are becoming more and more reliable, more and more higher performance stuff is coming up. For example, the kind of batteries that we have put out in the market today, they can be charged in as low as 15 minutes time. And given the infra improvement in the country, we can even go down to 6-7 minutes in the very near future. So, and that too combined with battery which can consistently and reliably work even at 60 degrees Celsius temperatures, which is not even the peak of what we can see in India, without any safety issues or any performance issues, and still give you a life of more than 20 years. So this phenomenal work happening on the battery front on various types of aspects that can be developed. And from that perspective, now, so far, what was happening was that the charger availability was there, the power was available on the chargers, but the batteries were not able to take it. For example, we had this Bharat DC chargers deployed in the market, right? And they were 15 kilowatt chargers or 20 kilowatt chargers, and they could, if the battery can take it, they could charge a two-wheeler in 5 minutes time. But the batteries were not able to take it. So now with battery advancement happening, fast charging is becoming the norm. And not just in the two-wheeler, three-wheeler, four-wheeler categories, but also in heavier vehicles like trucks and buses. And that would kind of revolutionize the entire EV ecosystem.
Just a quick follow-up. Do you think that will require any augmentation on the grid side, or are you saying that this is mainly from the battery side, which is now being achieved? But as batteries grow stronger, does our grid need to get stronger?
So, see, when we're talking about grid, right, we have to understand that today most of our grid power obviously comes from fossil-based generation, right? But we are very quickly turning towards solar and renewable energy being the major part of the grid. And if the grid has to become greener, it cannot become green without storage, because solar and wind are both intermittent sources of energy, and you need to kind of bank them into some kind of storage, whether it's battery-backed storage or whether it's pumped hydro or whatever various options are available, right? But it has to be stored. And if it has to be stored, then it can be either stored at a central location, or it can also be stored at a charging station itself. And once you store it, then there is no challenge in delivering power even to a truck or a bus, and even charging that larger vehicle within 10, 15, 20 minutes time. Because storage anyway has to come up. So you can always do decentralized storage for charging stations and then directly use it from that.
A very battery OEM answer. So maybe I'll turn to Vinayak at this point. Vinayak is from Fourth Partner Energy, and I think they're looking at they're coming from a solar background. How do you see the possibility of increasing the share of clean energy in the mix for EV charging? That seems to be a major priority for a lot of state governments. And is the regulation in place? What are the use cases where this is feasible? And how do you see the way forward in that?
Sure, sure. First of all, good afternoon, and thank you for having me here. As the fellow panelists pointed out, majority of the power in India's grid is from thermal sources. Having said that, I mean, as on January, India had like 395 gigawatt of total installed power generating capacity, of which 38% installed capacity was from RE sources, including hydro. And if you want to talk in terms of the energy delivered, then around 18 to 20% of energy supply is from RE sources. And as per CEA estimates, that number is expected to grow up to 44% by 2013. So we have to first of all appreciate the fact that there is a lot of efforts being undertaken, and the grid itself is becoming greener year over year. Having said that, I mean, there are a lot of use cases we see that where it is easy to marry RE with EV. And I would like to point out such use cases. First one being definitely large form factor charging hubs, whether it is for four-wheeler fleet operators or for buses. There you can easily procure power using open access model, for charging of EVs. And we ourselves have a large charging hub in Pune, near Viman Nagar, where we have taken 1 megawatt power connection because that's the constraint to source power using open access model. And we also have 180 megawatt of solar park under construction in Maharashtra. So it's easy for us to marry that RE with EV. Then second use cases, especially warehouses. Warehouses is a very peculiar case because they have large roofs area available, but their internal loads are typically very low. And we have a very live case, use case in our hand, where for a particular warehouse in Mumbai, we initially installed only a normal plain vanilla grid-tied solar system that cater to 40% of the energy demand. But now in second phase, we are incorporating stationary energy storage and will be doubling the solar capacity and will be meeting the 100% of the energy demand with solar plus storage. Even by doing that, we will be utilizing only 80% of its roof space. So there is still 20% roof space available where you can install solar, but there is no load. Now, here is a perfect use case that he can convert his last mile logistics fleet into electric vehicles and provide on-site charging for those vehicles and use that remaining 20% roof space for additional solar and cater to that. Additionally, if that those last mile vehicles, if they're capable for battery swapping, even better, because then you can charge the batteries whenever solar power is generating. So that's the second use case. And third use case being, let's say, commercial parks. Maxson did talk about 60% of the charging typically would happen at residential, or let's say endpoint charging. Outside of residential charging, I think charging in office spaces will be the second most location where charging will happen. And these commercial parks already have mandates to procure renewable power, and we are already supplying renewable power to them. Tomorrow, if their demands increase because of EV charging, all they have to do is procure more power using open access model. So there are these three use cases where I think it's easy to source renewable power for EV charging. Of course, there are some regulatory constraints like to procure power using open access, you have to have 1 megawatt of power, contract demand. But if there is a way to relax that criteria, especially for EV charging, then definitely there will be more opportunity to procure renewable power for EV charging.
Thanks, Vinayak. When we were speaking about strengthening the grid, maybe before we come to Jyoti, I want to come back to you also, Maxson, once. The renewable energy integration is one aspect, but we also have this grid right now, which is basically connected to almost 97 or 99% of the country or households. The numbers are growing. We're trying to reach 100% power connectivity. But if we're talking about integrating charging at the local level, there are a lot of constraints and discussions on the same. What do you think are some of the main things that need to be looked at today to enable charging at every nook and corner?
Right. This is a problem which India is looking into in the next 12 months is what I bet on, because we've been analyzing the international markets, be it Australia, New Zealand, Europe. There's an interesting point, and I mean, it may just get a bit technical. I mean, typically the sanction load at a home is around 5 kilowatt, maximum 7.5 kilowatt. And at nights you're using that, and on top of it now you need to put up a charger, which is typically 3.5 kilowatt. Hopefully it is going to go to 7.5 kilowatt on the type 2. So suddenly you are actually hitting the maximum demand sanction load, which means you are actually having to pay double the cost of electricity when you're doing residential charging. And this is an unknown aspect. Now complement it, or rather make it a bit more complex with the fact that while the existing last mile distribution networks are loaded at around 86%, and when I say the last transformer closest to your building is loaded at around 80%, which means there's only a markup of only 20% additional which is possible on the load side. Now these are some very interesting things that are happening, and the last mile availability of load, or in a very layman's term, the sanction load and the transformer transformer load, these are some bottlenecks we are going to hit very soon. Now think about it, you have a building park, a residential society, and you have 50 vehicles all charging at the same time in the night, and the kind of load factors you're putting it on the transformer, while at the other end it can be a positive as well, I'll come to that. But essentially this is one aspect, and something called as dynamic load management is what we will need to start thinking about right now. Otherwise we may have a problem of, and I hope that problem comes actually, because we should have that many more EVs on the road. But I think it's time to start thinking about how the international ecosystems are solving it. Those problems are going to hit India a lot more harder than other countries, because our last mile discoms are particularly slightly dated, be it the transformers or the copper cables that are sunk in. So I think that's something around 12 to 18 months away we are going to start hitting, and that's already started happening in Bangalore for that matter. We have residential societies which have gone in for community charging. And the moment you go from the 10th to the 11th, you have some challenges coming around. So what I see is charging is not going to be a static charger out there which is just going to dispense energy. It's going to be a lot smarter. And now connect it with the solar part of it and the discom, and suddenly you have a grid stabilization solution rather than a grid, equilibrium disruptor. So these kind of conversations, unfortunately, is happening only at startup levels or companies. But I think the one of the stakeholders, biggest stakeholder here is the discoms. And they need to be participative of this. We see a lot of discoms already working in that space, including Maharashtra for that matter, Karnataka, Delhi. But I think these understandings and learnings have to be put together, discussed, before we start to see this problem really on the ground. And this is what I think is one challenge we are going to face in the residential, or we call it as destination charging. That's going to hit us very soon. And hopefully it should hit us much faster than I can ever predict.
So over to you, Jyoti. I think this is a perfect segue actually to understand. You were speaking yesterday when we were talking about the sort of interface that will be needed to regulate the whole EV charging ecosystem, make it more accessible to consumers, maybe even something that can actually support some of these solutions in an integrated manner for grid management, load management. Can you speak about what some of these requirements are, what some of these solutions might be to make charging as accessible as possible, even as it is coming up everywhere?
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for that question. We actually started off with the same this thing that how do a person actually gets to charge at his home. Right now, what people do is they just kind of install a 3-pin socket or something and they start charging. And what Maxwell was pointing out here, we kind of realized this very first deployment in our own house itself, where we were charging 3-4 EVs in the night, and few of them basically started tripping. And that is when we realized that I think the problem is not going to be so easy. And if we are hitting it with only 3-4 two-wheelers, God knows what will happen when there are millions of two-wheelers coming on the road every year and in every house. How is it that is going to be managed actually? We kind of built the entire infrastructure, whatever we have built at Bolt, to kind of have this connectivity and basically smart management, grid management also built into it, where we kind of do active load balancing. We have actually started deploying in multiple tech parks where we have installed 20, 30, 40 chargers in their parking lots. And their sanction load has to be kind of now split in all these chargers to kind of manage this. So I think with basically greater adoption, these problems will start coming in. And in fact, in Bangalore, there was recent news of this transformer kind of blowing up because of the transformer hitting the roof of the whatever the sanction load was. And I think smart systems like what we are doing here at Bolt would, and also other startups, would kind of help stabilize the grid. And as and when the EV adoption is kind of starting to pick up as we move forward, these kind of stabilization and smart systems will play a much important role in terms of dispensing power safely also.
Thanks, Jyoti. You've sort of ended on safely, And I think safety is something that has been at the top of the ecosystem's mind over the past couple of weeks, given the recent unfortunate incidents that have happened with battery fires. So I would actually like to ask a couple of the panel members to opine on what is a safe pathway for batteries. So maybe Akshay, starting with you, how do we make our batteries safer and more reliable? Just simply.
So first of all, you have to understand why these things are happening, right? There are 2-3 reasons for it to happen. We have seen so many incidents recently, and it's not like these fire incidents or these mishaps have happened recently. There have been instances in the past. It's just that for the first time in India, we are seeing a decent population of EVs on the road, and these scenarios are coming out into the picture more prominently. And the reason is that all the battery technologies, for example, that have been created were never created or developed keeping the Indian conditions in mind. And when I say Indian condition, it includes the climatic condition that we have, the types of vehicle that we have. Like, for example, you see two-wheelers, three-wheelers, which are very India, Southeast Asia unique kind of proposition. We are the largest users and producers of two-wheelers and three-wheelers in the world. And similarly, the kind of usage patterns that we have, the average daily requirement, and if you're talking about commercial, the kind of routes that we follow, which are short and frequent. So that's very different from the rest of the world. Now, well, the entire temperate belt where most of battery innovation happens, it's all driven towards temperate climates for four-wheelers and beyond, right? And what we have done is we have just borrowed those technologies and whatever the cheapest that we could get our hands on, and then brought it into the country, hoping that everything will work fine, right? Many electric vehicles today, especially in the two-wheeler, three-wheeler category, don't even have any kind of thermal management system as well, right? So it's a short recipe in that sense. And then on top of it, when we can't blame the regulator or the customer both, because it's a new industry and everybody is growing and understanding how it works. And it's more so on the people in the industry like us to say that, okay, the regulator is growing up right now, but we have to do the best from our side. We have to make sure that this technology, this product can work out in the Indian conditions without fail. Because you cannot afford loss of life and property, right? Then you cannot transform the world from ICE to EV if that continues to happen. So we need batteries which are resilient enough, which are developed for Indian conditions. And if not at the cell level, at least there is proper thermal management which can kind of take care of it. And also there are solutions available. It's just about making the conscious choice. Some chemistries, some battery chemistries are far more resilient to Indian conditions as compared to others. So it's just going into the details of things, understanding what makes sense, both from cost perspective, quality, safety. We have to look at all of these things.
So a follow-up question there. What does that mean in terms of concrete regulations or standards that need to come up? At the moment, there seems to be a trade-off happening, especially in the lighter vehicles and smaller batteries, for lower cost batteries that maybe don't have BMS and thermal management. So is that something that needs to be required?
So already a lot of work is happening on that front. We were ourselves working with the regulatory bodies to come up with more stringent testing protocols or regulatory frameworks to basically check the batteries for Indian conditions and all of those things. Unfortunately, it was going a little slower, but now given these instances have happened, I'm hoping that very soon we will have newer testing protocols coming up, and those will be tested for higher temperatures, for the right kind of charging protocols, the right kind of BMS, life, and all of those things. So far, for example, even if you look at subsidy, right, it's only dependent upon the size of the battery. Now, many OEMs have cut corners in the sense that, okay, can I get the cheapest of the battery out there, irrespective whether it only works for 2 months, right? I don't care, but as long as the battery size is high enough, I can still get the subsidy in. So that's the reason we are seeing what we are seeing in the market today.
Right. Thanks, Akshay. And Maxson, that's from the battery side. But what about from the charger side? As you were saying, once the battery problem gets taken care of, the safety issue will move to the chargers. So what needs to be done to make sure this doesn't sort of keep continuing as a snowballing problem?
Right. I'm going to borrow from there is the fact that these incidents have been happening in the fire incidences, just that the numbers of vehicles have increased. Incidentally, if you were to analyze what's really happened, fires due to charging or wrong chargings are also happening. It's not battery all the time. Unfortunately, there's a huge amount of enormous, disproportionate focus on the battery. And like you rightly said, the moment the battery will get solved, we'll have people sitting on this dais here who are going to solve it. Soon there's going to be there's going to be a lot of draw towards the charging. Now, there's some very interesting aspects. The government of India, there are some standards already in place. You have to understand, EV is an automotive industry, which is highly regulated. There's some stringent norms. Also, these norms already exist. There's a standard called as AIS 318, which actually defines by, I mean, very specific by the word, what is the definition of an EVSE, electric vehicle supply equipment. Those definitions are already in place. Unfortunately, what happened is, and we have to understand, this is an ecosystem. There's nothing wrong about it. But the ecosystem initially was more about getting more vehicles on the road at the cheapest cost. Hence, many of the OEMs officially or unofficially used to start to say that, hey, use the 3-pin socket at your homes. That's what charging, and you can move. Great, that served its purpose. But that being positioned across as public charging will be one of India's Achilles heel, is what I sense right now, is because those are not made for public charging. Unmating systems for those 3-pin sockets really don't accord itself to public charging. So what I mean to say is the standards already exist. Fortunately, the committee which is now investigating into the fires and other safety norms, hopefully are addressing both the battery side and the charging side, and that's happening. We are very sure about it. And they are guided by the same AIS 318, which already is in place and already internationally. But the best part over here is, for when I sit here as a proud Indian, the 4-wheeler protocols, charging protocols, were defined by the West. Let's accept it. But we have a brilliant opportunity for defining that for 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers in India, because globally no one has that. And it is this time where, if we were to do it right, not only do we have the opportunity of defining a standard globally, we have the opportunity of owning it, and also probably, like someone said, India can become the EV capital, not on the back of only low-cost manufacturing, but on the back of a high IQ R&D protocols. These are the kind of conversations that need to happen here in India, and we have the option, the intention, the timing, and the ecosystem is there to support us. So these are some very interesting aspects on EV charging regulations that's happening.
If I can add an anecdote here, right? So when you're talking about charging a 2-wheeler, for example, at home, right? The load is typically around 3 kilowatt is what we are looking at. Whether it's a entry-level 4-wheeler or even a 2-wheeler, we have 3 kilowatt chargers which are provided along with the vehicle. That is more load than your air conditioner, right? You don't go around your house carrying the air conditioner and plugging it into a 5-amp mobile socket. And hence, it is very important for that awareness to come out there, and also the right kind of norms to come out there, that, okay, what kind of a plug you can really plug a 2-wheeler into. Otherwise, problems on the charger side itself will be far more phenomenal as we have more population of vehicles going out on the road.
Absolutely. And when Maxson, you were speaking about us having the opportunity to define the standards in India. So we have the LEV AC and LEV DC standards that have now sort of been done by BIS and the Department of Science and Technology. I'd actually like to ask Jyoti, increasingly with these standards, you're starting to see integration of communication technologies and smarter opportunities for charging, right? So do you see that picking up with the release of such standards and bringing maybe more conformity to the 2-wheeler and 3-wheeler space?
Yeah, so actually we are a part of these committees actually, and actively working with the government bodies and other private bodies to kind of formulate these policies. Like Maxson, what he has clearly pointed out here is that there are no standards before these LEV AC/DC kind of came out in the open, and even CEA guidelines for 2 and 3-wheeler charging, because nowhere in the world it was kind of figured out that these vehicles will also be kind of electric, and they also need some kind of standards to be followed. So I think this basically gives us a pretty good potential for India to kind of be the leader in this space, to kind of standardize these and make sure that the other part of the emerging market like Southeast Asia, Africa and others also adopt these technologies, which are much safer because they would be tested in Indian conditions also, right? Maxson?
Anything you'd like to add to that, Maxson?
Actually, yes. I mean, what I mean to see is at this point in time, we need to start thinking beyond. Let us not accept technology solutions which are the past. The moment we do that, unfortunately, India is, we accept as technology and it becomes ingrained into our ecosystem. This is the right time for us to start thinking about what is the future and what are the technologies of the future, what are the systems of the future. And it will require a kind of, it's an ecosystem view where the OEMs, the discoms, the regulators and companies have to work together. I think this is opportunities like this when such conversations happen. I mean, I like the way you don't carry an AC. I'm going to use that. You don't carry an air conditioner around. It's almost like that. And suddenly it draws on everyone, hey, listen, it's a little, you need to be a little bit more careful when you're charging. It's, by the way, I'd just like to qualify the statements. Electric vehicles are very safe. It's a lot more safer than carrying a petrol and diesel tank under your knees, what you do in a two-wheeler. But what I mean to say is, it's safe. Let's make it a little bit more safer. One wrong move and the entire ecosystem gets questioned. So I think that's one key aspect of how this opportunity comes. The fact that there is no regulation allows us to put that in place. And I think it's all behest on us, all of us, use EVs, but use it safely.
Thanks, Maxson. Now I'd like to move to one more aspect of the EV charging ecosystem that's spoken about a lot, that's seen as maybe a barrier sometimes, or at least a catalyst in other cases. The implementation and business models and the financial viability, which seems to be the big white elephant in the space sometimes. Starting with you, Vinayak, actually. A lot of the work you're doing is trying to bring in more renewables into the EV charging ecosystem. How is that in terms of the economics and the viability vis-a-vis, you know, say, standard grid charging? And how can that be, maybe how can the economics be improved, given that a lot of what government is trying to do right now is push the right solutions?
So first of all, a lot of the states, including Maharashtra, is also providing special tariffs for electric vehicle charging, which is a great thing because to push the adoption of e-mobility further. And we all know, like, procurement of solar power is not just helps you reduce your carbon footprint, but also it's commercially viable. With a simple grid-tied solar system, it definitely you save money and you save the negative environmental impact. You avoid that impact. But when you talk about battery integrated solar solutions, then yeah, so cost of battery is still relatively high. And it depends like what amount of backup you want to provide. So typically, let's say if you want to provide a constant load for 8 hours during daytime, let's say 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., then your levelized cost of electricity will be anywhere between 6 to 7 rupees per unit, which is still probably better than, lower than commercial tariffs in quite a few states, I would say. Only when you start looking towards, let's say, constant power for 12 hours, then that levelized cost will become 11 to 12 rupees or a little more than that. Then it will become, the viability goes down. It will be viable only in certain states, not all the states, and certain locations. For example, highways or remote location where the cost of bringing last mile power distribution is very high, then there you can possibly consider like a completely off-grid solution, just purely from availability of power standpoint, because that's where commercials really don't matter much as such. Yeah.
And zooming out just a little further, actually, if we're talking about really opening up the use of renewables, especially for transportation, to really strengthen and decarbonize the transport sector along with the electrification, what is the strengthening that needs to take place at the transmission level, at various levels? Because you come into all sorts of issues there, right? And here I want to draw on your background as a solar energy provider to see what it will really take to enable renewable energy to sort of flow freely through open access arrangements for transportation. Because you have generation in very limited locations. You're going to need to carry it over long distances. So anything at the sort of macro level, at the transmission level?
I don't think so. I mean, whenever large power parks, solar parks are built or wind parks are built, a lot of studies are done. You have to take a connectivity approval. That time, a lot of load flow analysis is done before that connectivity approval is given to any party before for evacuation of power into a particular substation. And I think transmission lines are not going to be challenged. The challenge is going to be mainly at the distribution level, or distribution transformer level. Let's say if you have a residential society, they have a certain capacity transformer. Now let's say whatever 30–40% of the residents adopt EVs, then you will pretty soon realize that you might exceed the distribution transformer capacity, and that's when the challenges will start happening. So I don't think there will be problems at the transmission lines, but mainly at the last mile distribution transformer level. Yeah.
That's useful to know. And one last question maybe is, what is the role of TOD tariffs and others in terms of actually maybe a passive way of getting more renewables used by sort of matching the time of generation with the time of use for charging?
Right. So, a good question. I mean, all the states have TOD slabs. The not problem, I would say, but the difference between, let's say, the peak our tariff or off-peak tariff is minimal, like 2 rupees maybe at the max, 2 to 2.5 rupees. Whereas in a lot of Western countries, that difference is very high. And having said that, I mean, obviously, having TOD slab-wise tariff is a good thing because, I mean, peaking powers are expensive. So we should promote EV charging to happen during, let's say, off-peak hours, where you can use the base load power plants to supply that power.
Yeah, and I think that's where another panelist was saying, like, workplace charging is also important. So when you make charging available everywhere, that is when you can actually have charging happen at the time where renewable generation is happening.
The beauty of workplace charging is that it will happen when the solar generation would be at its peak, typically, right? So it automatically solves a lot of problems. You don't need to store it. While it's being generated, your car is getting charged.
Right, yeah. And now that we've spoken about the viability and implementability of the renewable energy angle, Maxson, overall, is charging viable? Is it viable today? Will it be viable in 5 years? And what is needed to make it viable?
So I'm well known for this contrarian statement. EV charging is a social service. And let me prove it to you. Till such time, I mean, I'll give you some statistics. If you were to put up a DC charger, let's say on the highway, you need to have continuously 6.5 charge, on an average, 6.5 charging every day for the next 3 years to even recover the cost of the charger and the infrastructure. And let's be honest about it. I mean, we should not be telling anything otherwise. And that's where, but that is only one element of charging, which is the highway charging. Fortunately, what's happening, and I want to be, the government of India is doing a lot of work in that space. We are actually part of the FAME2 subsidy scheme, under which we are putting up 2,950 charges across 34 cities in India, where the VGF is provided by the government. It's already in place, and that's happening. And that's the only way it can be viable. But let's look at business where it is. It's a fleet charging, where utilization is much more than, I mean, I'll just give you some numbers. 26% is the highest utilization on a highway charging across the globe. Right? Now, move to the other side, fleet charging. Fleet charging, I wish, and I have fellow panelists who are chasing me down and saying, put up more chargers. It's because there are more vehicles on the road, and these are commercial vehicles who need to have charging because the next day their ability to generate revenue is dependent upon whether they are charged or not. And that's where the business really lies, is on the fleet charging. So to answer your question, that's where the utilization, driven by utilization, the guarantees, those are working out. Now let's come to residential charging. Unfortunately, we are in a space where both things are panning out. It's kind of a pseudo model where either it cannot be pure charging as a service which will work out. Till such time, the community also invests in the charging infrastructure. Now, unknown to many, it's not the cost of the charger. If I have to spend 100 rupees on a charger, I have to spend 150 rupees for the, it's not as cheap as that, but just giving you a, ratio. Close to around 150% to 200% is the cost of the backend infrastructure to just make charging happen. This is for public charging. So what we see is globally, of course, it's a chicken and egg story. If we don't do it, then we won't have more vehicles. But what we are sensing is you need to have a good balance of, if you have a good mix, and that's what we are doing at Magenta, is we are not focusing only one element, we have multiple business streams, and that's allowing us to find a positive revenue model in that case. And I think that's the only way. We'll have to be smart about how we are doing. And happily what's happening is we have OEMs also who are supporting that case. So at this point in time, highway charging or public charging as people call it, there's a viability gap issue. Fleet charging works. Residential charging, right now, we are in the midst of it turning positive.
Can I add a little bit? Yeah. So, I mean, especially for fleet charging, it's easy to achieve 60–80% of utilization, and which is great. That's where you definitely recover the cost or make money. And Maxson talked about the cost of upstream infrastructure is almost as much as the cost of the charger. So it's very important to have shared infrastructure. At least the upstream infrastructure has to be shared, because you can share that between, let's say, four-wheeler fleets, two-wheeler charging with battery swapping for three-wheelers, maybe bus charging. And if you do that, then it's definitely possible to at least achieve that break-even levels. It's possible, I would say.
So yeah, I have some thoughts on this actually. We think that in the next 10–15 years or so, everyone is going to buy a EV, and they are going to kind of install a charger at least at their own homes to charge their own vehicles. So what if they are able to share it with their friends, family, and their social network or their community? And I think majority of the times, we are mostly at a social network. Like 99% of the time, I am either at my home, at my office, or my friend's place or colleague's place. So if I am able to find a charging point at those locations where they have installed it themselves for their own use case and they are able to share it with me, I think majority of the charging problem will be solved inside the city. And for outside the city, I think like we are working on some technologies to kind of reduce the cost, because what some of the panelists were saying here, most of the development in the four-wheeler sector has happened in the developed markets. So their price considerations, their basically vehicle, standards are very different than what we would kind of follow here. So we are doing some like bottoms-up research from each and every component and stuff to kind of get the cost down of the fast chargers as well. And I think pretty soon we'll be out with some products which will kind of be suitable for Indian standards, and the ROIs will be much lesser for those kind of products, right? That's what we are doing essentially.
A P2P charging network. Interesting.
Can I add a few points
I
here?
actually want, okay, to this? Or,
Yeah, to the viability of the charging scenario itself. See, the way at least I look at it, right? Public charging has to be fast charging, because nobody would have time to charge in public at a slow rate. You can't be standing 2–3 hours at a point just waiting the vehicle to be charged. So it has to be fast. Now, when we talk about fast charging, there are two distinctions in fast charging itself. Just putting out some fundamentals out there, right? There is some 100-volt categories, and then there is above 200–300-volt category of vehicles. Now, in the sub-100-volt category, we already saw Bharat DC chargers, as we call them here, and internationally it's called the GB/T protocol, right? Now, those chargers, as Maxson mentioned, like it was public service, because these chargers were initially deployed for Mahindra Varito, then Rara Tagore, and not even, certain cases, not even one vehicle would turn up in a week's time. But with fleets coming in, right, and with two-wheelers and three-wheelers, as we opened them up for GBT protocol, right, now they bring in consistent demand, right, and so consistent demand that I can give minimum guarantees to Maxson that, boss, put up a charger over here, and these many vehicles will turn up consistently. Right, so that is becoming possible. And what happens with that is that based on commercial demand, the population of chargers grow. And tomorrow it's available for everyone, even for you and me, for my home vehicle in that sense. And the same trend I expect to see in the above 300 volt category as well, wherein these vehicles, these chargers will initially be used for, let's say, charging a taxi for that matter, or for charging a four-wheeler truck or a bus. And then as the population grows, then any vehicle, any personal vehicle also can turn up there and charge.
Absolutely. And I think we're almost at time. So maybe one last closing statement from each of you, starting with you, Vinayak. What do you see as maybe the one big thing happening in the next 1 year in EV charging?
What's the one last, sorry.
The one big thing that you see happening in the next 1 year in the EV charging space, or that you hope to see?
EV charging space. I think today, so we have GB/T protocols for fleet vehicles, and a lot of the personal mobility vehicles do use CCS protocol. I think slowly the fleets might also start moving to CCS protocol, and that's one change that will happen, I believe. But we'll have to figure out what will be that optimal power rating of that charger has to be, so that it can cater to fleet vehicles as well as the personal mobility vehicles. But in addition to that, I would like to say that supply and demand load management is going to be a very, very important thing. And maybe you will have to have a capability that, let's say, a charger is capable to deliver 25 kilowatt power through single gun, and let's say it has 2 guns, but as soon as, or it has, let's say, even 3 guns, but as soon as there are multiple, if there is multiple vehicles connected to the charger, then there is a capability to derate the charger and deliver lower power. Those kind of solutions, supply-demand matching solutions will be coming up pretty soon.
Thanks, Vinayak. The rest of the panelists, I would urge you to keep it to 2 lines.
My expectation is whatever is a model bylaw right now for 25% charging in residential societies should become an enforceable notification. Automatically charging at your residential societies will be sorted.
I'm with you on that.
I think we will see a lot more charging points, and I think in the next 1 to 2 years, if that's the horizon, a lot of the range anxiety will be out of people's mind. I think that is a positive change I would like to see, and with the OEMs we are working with, I think that is something which we are working towards, and we will see a lot more EVs also on the road.
I think this year, at least from our side, you will see charger availability on the wheels. To improve availability of chargers, we have come up with this product, which is a charger on wheel. You can call it, and it will, your vehicle can get charged anywhere, wherever you are stuck. So I think we'll be scaling it up this year. It will be a great option in the market.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you so much for your time, and we hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, panelists, for that insightful discussion, and a huge thank you to WRI for putting this panel together.